Nuestro primer invitado en esta mañana es David Warsh y voy a leer un poco sobre su semblanza. David Warsh es propietario de economicprinciples.com, una columna semanal online independiente soportada por los lectores que comenzó en el año 2002. Antes de eso, David cubrió la fuente de economía para el Boston Globe por 20 años y antes fue reportero de negocios para la revista Forbes, el Wall Street Journal y la revista Newsweek, entre otros. Es graduado de la Universidad de Harvard y 2 veces ganador del premio Gerald Loeb, el máximo honor en la información financiera y de negocios en Estados Unidos. Es autor de 3 libros: La idea de la complejidad económica, Los directores económicos, Masters y Mavericks en la economía moderna, y más recientemente, El conocimiento y la riqueza de las naciones, la historia de un descubrimiento económico. Y esta mañana nos va a ofrecer la conferencia magistral titulada El conocimiento y la riqueza de las naciones, historia de un descubrimiento económico. Démosle un aplauso a David Warsh.
Gracias, Luisa. Buenos días. I speak no Spanish. I am a newspaperman all my life. I live in Boston. For 20 years, as Luisa said, I was the economics columnist of the Boston Globe. The paper changed hands and I moved to the web in 2002, and I do the same thing that I did then. I write less often. I write once a week a column about economics, sometimes a little bit more about politics, on the web at economicprinciples.com. It's free, it's easy to find, and I recommend it. Did that fall down? Thank you. But I'm a very reclusive reporter. I seldom go out. I've really never been in Mexico before, and you might wonder, as I wondered, why I'm here. Well, I'll tell you. Back in May, I received in maybe 3 days, the space of 3 days, 2 invitations to speak in Latin America. One, to speak to a huge national Chamber of Commerce operation in Lima, and the other to speak with science journalists here. Obviously, something was up. I didn't know what, but 10 years ago, I had written a book about one particular economist, a fellow named Paul Romer, whom I'm going to talk about, and I was sure it had something to do with him. He's always on the short list for the Nobel Prize in Economics. I thought perhaps, although Nobel deliberations are very secret and were unlikely to have leaked out, but I knew it might come up in October. But I only had to wait 2 months to find out the reason that those 2 invitations had been extended. Romer, in the summertime, accepted the job as chief economist of the World Bank, and it was that information that had gotten out equally quickly in Mexico City. I think actually Mexico City was first and Lima was second. But Peru was in the middle of an election, you know, the Kuczynski-Fujimori election, and I don't have much enthusiasm for talking to chambers of commerce and businessmen, but I certainly like talking with journalists. So here I am, and I'm gonna speak in 3 parts about the story of Paul Romer and the story of knowledge and the wealth of nations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to it, the 200 years between 1776 and 1976, when the story really starts. And then I'm going to tell the story, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened since, maybe in the last 10 years. Economics, I'll bet you there aren't any other economics journalists here. Is there anybody here who's principally concerned with economics as a science? I bet, good. Yeah, some. That's enough. You know, the decision in 1969 of the Swedish Academy to start giving, the Swedish Academy of Sciences to start giving a Nobel Prize is still somewhat controversial, but it reflected at the time a pretty widespread judgment that economics had in the 20th century coalesced around a body of a consensus about certain verities that made it reasonable to call it a science. It was no part of Alfred Nobel's will. He had in mind chemistry and physics, and he didn't say biology. He in the terminology of the 1890s, he distinguished between medicine and physiology. That's about the state of the science. But by the excuse me, the middle 60s, the Swedish Academy said in essence that sciences grow organically over time, and just as physiology and medicine had become biology, economics had become a science, and I'm very much in the camp that agrees with that and that takes it seriously. There's certainly people, mainly of the left, but not philosophically of the left, who still doubt it, and you can get an argument about it, but not from me. Economics really sort of happened. The paradigm that has informed it ever since was to be found in Adam Smith's book, published in London in 1776, and for the next 25 years, people knew people concerned with natural philosophy, which is what it was called at the time, not science, but natural philosophy. They knew something important had happened, but they didn't know exactly what. Smith seemed to explain the differences in the wealth of nations in a way that, in a satisfactory fashion, that nobody had before. By 1815, excuse me, things had settled down quite a lot. David Ricardo wrote a book, basically the first textbook of economics, that made it into a very clear set of doctrines about diminishing returns, rising costs for doing things, and in essence the problem of running out of things, running out of land, or running out of food, or running out of space for people. It was sort of Malthus came up with the same idea at the same time, and that more than anything else concretized in the minds of people the idea that economics was a science. For the next 100 years, economics developed mainly in England, partly in France, a little bit in Germany, hardly at all in the United States, and in quite a lot in Italy too, in a different way. But the result was that by the end of the 19th century, by the beginning of the 20th century, economics had a strong body of knowledge that people took for granted, the sort of thing that you study in high school or first year in college here. The principal textbook of the early 20th century was a book called Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall, and people felt pretty good about that, pretty complacent. Until 1930, when the Great Depression began, and the Great Depression was a real crisis for economics that had many consequences all around the world, but not the least of them was that the Depression plus the unrest in Europe, the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Nazis, resulted in a big shift of all the intellectuals who could get out of Europe into the United States, into a university system that was very well set up to give them jobs and put them to work. And at that point, the loudest voice in all of economics was John Maynard Keynes, still in England, but traveling frequently to Washington and giving advice that was now, it seems to us, quite intuitive. But then it was very counterintuitive. Keynes's basic message was, don't worry about balancing the budget. Keep up the spending stream by having the government engage in each case, the British government, the United States government, the Swedish government, the Mexican government, engage in compensatory spending to prevent people from being thrown out of work. That had, to people who did economics, the effect of a revolution. It was, in essence, turning upside down cherished doctrines, and it very quickly became dominant within the economics profession. Sweden had very good luck applying those policies in the 30s, and of course the all-out spending of the Second World War sort of drove home the truth of the efficacy of the policy in the United States, and economics emerged from the Second World War with a very good reputation, and Keynes with the best reputation of all. Three other economists had been prominent in the 30s. Irving Fisher, the first really great American economist, was in the policy arena in those years. Friedrich Hayek, a Viennese guy who'd gone to London as sort of the representative of the Austro-Hungarian German tradition, he was briefly very important in the 30s. And Joseph Schumpeter, another Austrian who'd come to the United States, was very, very quickly important. They were all forgotten. As soon as the war was over, Keynes is who was remembered. And around the work of Keynes, American economists, notably Paul Samuelson, began to put together a body of doctrine known as that came to be known as macroeconomics, macroeconomics of the system as a whole. As opposed to microeconomics, that set of preoccupations that had engaged the profession all through the 19th century. Well, that went on very smoothly until, say, John Kennedy was elected in 1960. By that time, the United States, by that time, Europe had reindustrialized and got back on its feet completely from the destruction of the war. The United States had boomed for 20 years at that point, the longest expansion in history. Japan was back in good shape, and the prestige of economics was very, very high. There were problems internal to the discipline that began to be solved. And during the war, in 1944, the Hungarian mathematical physicist John von Neumann had published a book called The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, the first really broad statement of game theory that said, in essence, economics is very fine, but it's good that economics has got started, but it hasn't begun to contend with the social aspect of the science. It's still basically modeled on a sort of a notion borrowed from physics of equilibrium of prices and quantities. And as soon as you begin to put people into the equation, it becomes much more complicated. By 1960, that had begun to penetrate the discipline itself, especially in the work of Kenneth Arrow, who had been at Stanford, but at that point came to Harvard University and began to train a new generation of economists who were schooled in game theory and strategy and in interpersonal relations. And by 1970, there was excitement, not crisis, but excitement in economics about the new horizons that Arrow had opened up. And of course, in the world economy, the 70s were turning out to be quite a tough time. That's the background to the story I'm about to tell about this guy, Paul Romer. all the excitement in this story and much of the excitement in economics took place in these years at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s as this invasion of game theory into economics, into general equilibrium economics, began to really take hold, and kids who were young then, who are now in their 60s, began to make real breakthroughs in the terms of economic science, and none, I assert, was more important than what Romer was about to do. He was a smart kid from a big family in Colorado. His father was a lawyer. His father was a John Deere farm machinery dealer. He had gone to Yale Divinity School. He was a serious Episcopalian. He was a very interesting guy, and in due course, he became governor of the state of Colorado. He had, I think, 7 children. Romer was the second of them. All the kids turned out well, but Romer was the one who had a real scientific bent, and he went to the University of Chicago and graduated in 1975 in physics and mathematics. But already physics was deflating somewhat from its 20 or 30 years of boom and lots of money and stuff, and Romer that last year in college was persuaded to go into economics instead. He'd thought about becoming a lawyer, but he recognized that law and economics were growing closer and closer together, and that he understood that he'd do much better as an economist / lawyer than as a lawyer who didn't know economics. So he went to MIT in 1977, and he did the 2-year basic core curriculum that all graduate students do, and he met a woman who was interning at one of the hospitals in Boston, and they married, and because part of the requirement of her funding was that she go back to Kingston, Ontario, and do her internship in Canada, he took a leave from MIT after those first 2 years. And went with her, and had nothing to do except take courses on the side at Queen's University in Kingston, which is one of the 2 or 3 best Canadian universities. And there he began to completely rethink what he'd learned at MIT about macroeconomics, basically. To that point, the theory of growth in economics was something that was sort of off to the side, not the mainstream general equilibrium theory that had come up during the 19th century, nor really the macroeconomics, which had to do with aggregate economics about big sections of gross national product, which had been sort of cobbled together by Samuelson, Bob Solow, Franco Modigliani, a bunch of other people, as a kind of an emergency response to the situation that of the Great Depression. The growth theory at that point had been developed by Robert Solow, basically by comparing data from very careful data from 20 years at the turn of the century about the relative contributions of capital and labor to measured gross national product. And what Solow had found was that the increase in capital on the one hand, the increase in labor on the other hand, explained something like 12% of the increase in GNP in those 20 years. The other 88% in that first original cut was completely unexplained by the 2 factors that had been measured. And so Solow followed a classic scientific strategy and just put those outside the model that he was dealing with in economics. He exogenized them and called the result the residual. They were doing the same thing, physicists were doing the same thing with the neutrino at that point, a particle that seemed to be plausible to explain what they were seeing in cloud chambers, but they couldn't find a neutrino. So they said the measurement error must be the result of the neutrino smashing around in cloud chambers, but they couldn't find it. 20 years later, they found it, and the strategy was borne out. And Solo's residual went along for the next 20 years as just something that people took for granted. It was basically understood as the result of technical change. We got better and more knowledgeable at doing things. But how we got better and more knowledgeable at doing things was not part of the problem that economists took seriously. Romer took it seriously and began to write down models that involved the growth of knowledge as a matter of deliberate, purposeful commercial investment in creating new knowledge in corporations or in laboratories or in garages or as an economic process that had to be explained. And in the course of doing this, he realized that he couldn't go back to MIT. It wasn't what MIT was interested in. Macroeconomics wasn't. So instead, he went back to the graduate department at the University of Chicago, where he'd been an undergraduate. This was a big change, and this is sort of in the book that I wrote, which I should have bought a copy, has a very good Spanish translation. It's all laid out. It's been 10 years since I talked about this or thought about it very hard, and I'm going to just arm wave as I go on to the second, more interesting part of this, and say that over the course of the next 4 years, Romer did the equivalent of moving from Rome to Protestant headquarters in Wittenberg in Germany or something. He completely switched from the Keynesian liberal MIT tradition at MIT to the much more conservative seeming tradition at Chicago, and built a model that respected all of the Chicago prior convictions about the absolute necessity of perfect competition in the world, that was sufficient to be published in 1986 as a model of increasing returns with perfect competition. Increasing returns is this problem that I adverted to at the beginning. In the 19th century, when economists were full of enthusiasm for the insights of David Ricardo in particular, diminishing returns were taken for granted. The idea that the world was running out of land, of food, of minerals, of space. And therefore, rising prices were one of the absolute articles of faith in economics. Coal was in the 1870s, it was coal that they were convinced they were running out of. And for a little while before that, whale oil. They thought they'd be living in the dark forever after, or going back to candles, because they were running out of whales. Nobody at that point foresaw petroleum. And the advent of petroleum is one of those things that economics had sort of left out, exogenized as part of it. Was precisely that was ascribed to this residual of sort of somebody described it as manna from heaven at some point, of just knowledge that would descend upon the human race, and things would get better instead of worse. Romer took all this seriously in the very narrow and technical grammar of economics. And when he was done in 1986, he produced something that looked like the old-fashioned diminishing returns economics, but in fact was still trying to explain the increasing returns that had been so much a part of people's lives since the 1900. And at that point, and this is sort of the action in the book, he had to go back and readopt some of the conventions that had developed in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at MIT, and before that at Harvard, of monopolistic competition, of competition where power and strategy and relative position made a big difference. And in just a period of a year and a half, he completely turned upside down his model the 86 model, and produced a model in 1990 of increasing returns that depended on knowledge that was privately created through investments, purposeful investments by economic actors, that they could then keep control of for a period of time and make money at. That was the incentive to invest in discovering some new process in the first place, and that might eventually be passed out to other people, but not without people earning a good return on the research and development that they'd already done. This was very severe high mathematics done on a yellow legal pad, and only after the fact translated back into natural language. But when it was translated back into natural language, Romer had introduced two new terms into economics that simply hadn't been there before. There was a little bit of it in public finance, but they really hadn't been there at all. And the two terms were easy to understand. Rival goods. Rival goods were those that could be possessed by only one person at a time, and non-rival goods, which were basically intellectual goods that could be possessed by any number of people at the same time. And non-rival goods had their economic justification in the fact that they were partially excludable from the very beginning, meaning you could keep them secret, so other people wouldn't know what you were doing. You could have a secret recipe for a transistor, and other people who hadn't made the investment in learning the technology wouldn't know how to do it, and you'd be able to sell transistors to people for 10 or 15 years before other people figure it out. Or you could patent the knowledge that you'd created, and from the legal system you could get some protection for it. And so suddenly partially excludable and non-rival goods moved all around the world in the late 80s and early 90s in policy circles, people who didn't, and graduate departments, people who studied economics and people who looked to economics for bright new ideas to take to the political marketplace, got very excited about this. And in a simple way, what Romer had done in economics did nothing more than authorize people to tell, as profound wisdom, very familiar business stories. And I'll tell you parenthetically now, one of the business stories that I like best of all. Is Russell Marker, the name of Russell Marker, a household word among you? Is he somebody who's well known to Mexicans? Syntax, everybody knows syntax. So Marker was an American chemist who was born in 1902 to a sharecropper family in western Maryland, in the tidewater of the United States, in a log cabin, all the traditional advantages, bare feet, no high school education, but a pretty good, a rudimentary high school education, pretty good facility at math that was good enough to get him into a basically free 4 years at the University of Maryland, where he met chemistry for the first time and turned out to be a pretty good chemist, in fact, a very good chemist. That got him hired by the ethylene company, which had just been formed in New York in, say, 1920, to develop tetraethyl lead as an energy extender for gasoline. Cars were just coming into their own, and people were trying to get more mileage out of. So ethylene was investing money in scientists to make sure that tetraethylene lead didn't poison people in the atmosphere. Turned out it did, but in the meantime, it made gasoline work a lot harder than before. Marker basically invented the octane rating system for that. But while he was doing that, it turned out he was so good at synthesizing organic chemistry that he got a good job at the Rockefeller Institute, which was the fanciest place then. A brand new kind of an idea that did nothing except invest in new knowledge in the hopes that it would turn out to be economically productive. Marker wanted to work on hormone synthesis, especially testosterone and progesterone, which in the 20s were recognized as sort of at the heart of sexual reproduction. But the Rockefeller Institute wouldn't let him. So he quit and he went to a university in the middle of Pennsylvania called Penn State, very low prestige and stuff, but lots of freedom to do what he wanted. So he started working on synthesizing progesterone. At that point, it was well known by doctors that a little bit of progesterone would make pregnancy for women much easier if they got in trouble. But the only way of getting progesterone was to take hundreds of gallons, sometimes thousands of gallons, of the urine of pregnant horses, pregnant mares, and boil it down to get a gram or two of progesterone. Marker knew that you could not synthesize progesterone because other chemists, German chemists, had established that there was sort of a stable bond in the only way they knew of getting progesterone from urine that couldn't be broken, it couldn't be synthesized. But to that point, they've been trying to synthesize this from the roots of vegetables, especially sarsaparilla in the United States, the little tiny narrow root. Marker discovered that you could break that bond, that carbon ring, and synthesize it, but he could never get as many sarsaparilla roots as he needed. So he'd signed up with Park Davis, a drug company in Detroit, and they'd agreed to bankroll his going all over the southwest United States looking for a big root like the sarsaparilla root. Well, he finally found it in fields south of Veracruz. It was a huge Mexican yam that he identified from smell called the Cabeza de Negro that had evolved in this field. But these things grew to 100 pounds. And so he said, I found a source for this stuff. I'll go back to Detroit and get Park Davis to send me back. But Park Davis wouldn't send him back for one reason or another. I'll come to that. So he took his life savings and went back to Veracruz himself, hired a bunch of laborers and went down and harvested thousands of pounds of these yams. And boiled them down and did his reaction on them, the degradation. And when he was done, he had 3 big jars of progesterone, more than anybody had ever imagined. He took it back to Park Davis in Detroit and said, here's what I did. The yams are in Veracruz. I'd like to begin manufacturing this in Mexico. And the head of Park Davis said, absolutely not. There's no way. I was on my honeymoon in Acapulco 2 years ago. Mexicans are lazy, they're dirty, and they're stupid, and if it were up to me, I'd build a wall between here and Mexico. There's no way that you're going back to Mexico. So Marker took his 3 mason jars, maybe he took his 3 mason jars of progesterone and went back to Mexico City and went into business with a Hungarian lawyer and a Mexican chemist and formed the company Syntex. That worked for about a year, and then Marker tired of the Hungarian, and with 3 other Mexican chemists, he formed Botanica Mexico the next year, and then one more little company that went into business. And in the competition between the 3 hormone companies in Mexico City began the rise of the Mexican synthetic hormone industry, which is enormous. I ran into this when I discovered that half the crystallographers and half the hormone chemists in Cambridge, Massachusetts had been trained in Mexico, and were Mexican for the most part. It wasn't just hormone chemistry. The Mexican Chemical Society continued to grow, and it's a booming business today. Marker at that point in 1947 just quit chemistry, walked off the job, and people just assumed that he'd died. It turned out that he had begun faking Aztec artifacts. He'd make reproductions of Aztec and Mayan things, bury them in the ground, treat them with chemicals for 20 years, and sell them to collectors, either telling them or not, but living a very nice life, going back and forth between Veracruz and Pennsylvania, 3 years at a time. 30 years later, people realized what a remarkable transplant what a remarkably successful transplant this had been, and began celebrating the contribution of Marker first in the United States, then a big celebration in Mexico City in 2000. And Marker surprised everybody by walking into the thing. They'd figured he was dead at that point, but he wasn't, and he lived until 2006, I think. I tell this story because it's a perfect example of the phenomenon that Romer explained to the satisfaction of university economics in the 1990s. And by the mid-90s, politicians everywhere understood that not just research and development, but education were absolutely crucial to the process of development. And in fact, all of the development economics that had come up after the Second World War began to be pushed aside because of this growth economics, a chase in which many other economists had joined. And everybody agreed at that point, say in 1995, that Romer would one day win a Nobel Prize. But just like Russell Marker, Romer then more or less quit the profession and walked off the job. And this is the third part of what I want to tell about. But by the end of the 90s, governments, the German government, for instance, the most conservative in the world, was explaining to its citizens that it was going to sell all the gold in its vaults that it had used to back the mark for those years, and instead put the money into universities. Politicians all over the world were building new universities and funding more deeply old ones. Romer had he'd left Chicago for University of California at Berkeley, and then he'd left Berkeley for Stanford. But in 1998, he really sort of just quit. He went off and became the U.S. government's witness in the Microsoft trial, trying to break up Microsoft. That was thrown out when George W. Bush got elected, and then he founded a company that did machine grading for testing students in school, which became very successful. He sold it for $35-40 million a couple of years later, and then he resigned from Stanford altogether in 2007, just about the time my book came out. He completely went to ground for a year and a half or something like that, and then he reemerged without a university job in a TED Talk. Do you all know what TED Talks are? Do you see TED Talks? TED is this operation that it's really interesting. It's this sort of demi-monde, someplace between science and newspapers. A TED Talk involves somebody with a bright idea talking for precisely 17 minutes, 19 minutes, I don't remember, but it's a very succinct form where they walk around and give a very carefully prepared presentation and pose as thought leaders for a new generation. What Romer's TED Talk was about was not about this business of non-rival versus rival goods and the discovery, the explanation of increasing returns in economics. It was instead about an idea that he called charter cities. Charter cities were something that he'd begun to think about watching the Chinese experience of building complete, great, big new cities, and then sort of turnkey cities, both in China and in Indonesia and in Singapore. They'd build the housing, they'd build the factories, they'd build the police stations and the fire departments, they'd install judges and police, especially in China, and then they just turn the thing on, and people would stream from the countryside into the city and begin building iPhones and things like that. It's part of the long strategy of development that China had followed ever since Mao died, and they got the Cultural Revolution behind them. But Romer's reasoning in this TED Talk and in pieces he wrote about it were that other countries could do the same, but that the really key dimension was that before they could attract investment, they had to have legal systems and systems of policing and law and order that were really dependable. And in Romer's formulation, any city, any nation with a big rural population that wanted to grow quickly could create a charter city preferably on some unused part of it generally needed a port, he reasoned, so that it could transport goods cheaply. But it had to have a third nation, a second nation, be a guarantor of its legal system. This is analogous to the way Hong Kong had developed since the 1840s, when the British just grabbed it away from China and said, "We're in charge. You can do anything you can want. Chinese citizens can go into any kind of business that they want, but we intend to run the courts and the policing system." So he took this idea successfully to the government of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, which was very envious of what had happened on the island of Mauritius, about 1,000 miles away. Mauritius in the 1970s had done just this. They changed their commercial code dramatically, and it passed a whole lot of new securities laws that in essence guaranteed to protect the investment of any foreign firm that wanted to invest in Mauritius manufacturing clothing. And once it was clear that the promise could be depended upon, clothing manufacturers flocked from Hong Kong down to Mauritius, where the cost of labor was about a tenth. This, like Guadalajara was here. It's like special manufacturing zones. But in Romer's formulation, it required a guarantor, the Canadians, the Swedes, the Norwegians, somebody with some sort of a reputation for even the Brits. Their reputation is not so good. But he sold this idea to the government of Madagascar, and just as the port was about to open, they had a perfect port. There was a coup. The government was overthrown, and the whole thing went up in flames. He tried again in Honduras and almost got there with, I think, the Canadian government. No, he had, instead of a government, it was a panel of distinguished and reputable people who promised to guarantee the decisions of the Supreme Court in Honduras. Then at the last moment, the government installed a bunch of its cronies on that, and Romer had to walk away, and the whole thing collapsed. But the idea of charter cities has now been floating around for 10 or 15 years. There's nothing in it that says that a government with a good reputation can't do it the way China did it, just strictly on its own. But this is the idea that got Romer hired last summer as the chief economist at the World Bank, and that's what got me here, and that's what I'm telling you about now. This is. This isn't so germane, except insofar as Romer is a person of interest, I think, to the Mexican government and people who advise it. He will win a Nobel Prize one of these years, and then he'll become famous in a way that he isn't now. He's taking that World Bank job makes you pretty famous. To begin with, he hasn't even begun his sort of public crusading, but you'll hear more about him as time goes on. So likely did New York University, where he teaches now, think it was that he was going to be cited this year for the Nobel Prize, that they planned a press conference last week, and then some public relations person accidentally put the invitation to the press conference up on the web. So it was their conviction that Romer would get it this year was exposed, and everybody was embarrassed, including Romer. It may happen next year. It may not happen for another 5 years, but it will happen. In the meantime, he'll use the World Bank job to publicize these ideas more and more. He'll become famous the way Joe Stiglitz is famous, or maybe the way Stiglitz became famous because of the World Bank job. Danny Roderick, who is a wonderful economist, didn't take the job this time, but is sort of a more sober version of Romer, because at the very time that he took the World Bank job, he also began writing a blog in which he began to attack the main conventions of modern macroeconomics now, and he'll become more and more well known for that in coming weeks. And I guess the only value I'm adding to you today, aside from talking about science journalism, is to say that part, the second front of the war that opened, that Romer has opened, that's not going very well. He's not widely followed in the profession, I don't think, yet, and it's unlikely that he's going to make much progress, having left research economics 20 years ago now and stuff. But it's a really interesting story about how university economics goes forward and finds its way into policies of governments, the Mexican government, the German government. Everybody is engaged in this now. Everybody has a science, technology, education component to it. And the terms in which we speak about it all flowed out of those 4 or 5 years of intense work at MIT, at Queens, and at the University of Chicago. And that's the basis of the claim that I make, that economics really is a science, and that more journalists should follow it. Now, I'll write about this on Sunday on my blog, and you could get, if you cared for it, you could get a more coherent, straightforward article about this. If you look it up on Sunday, Google my name, it'll come right up. But in the meantime, let's see if you can. Let's you ask some questions, and I'll buckle on my translator, and see if we can elucidate this some more. Who will be first?
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Manuelino. I'm a science journalist, but I used to work in a newspaper called El Economista, which has nothing to do with The Economist, we wish. So I'm interested, but I really don't know about economics, I mean. And I was wondering, most of the people knows that there are certain things, for example, in physics, that are true. I mean, we don't understand quantum mechanics, but we know that there are electrons and photons, and we don't know really what they do, but we know somebody does, right? And I was wondering, what kind of things does economics has that are actually true, that we might know that they are actually true? And the other thing I was wondering is if people in other countries, I mean, I don't know, in the States or probably in England, know these things from high school, because what we know from physics or from Darwinism comes from high school, right? So what is true? And certain, I don't know, certain things that are small but that we don't know is true.
Yeah, that's right at the center of all this claim about economics as a science. And it's not easy to answer the question. It has to do with the fact that economics is a social science, I think, meaning that it has to do with us, with how people are. It's very hard to say things that are universally true about people. Electrons, they don't care what you think about them or do to them. They just behave in a certain mechanistic fashion, no matter what. So physics has the luxury of dealing, in chemistry too, of dealing with non-sentient entities, commodities. Economics doesn't have that, and for that reason, economics is at the very best, it's a really, really young science. But there are a few things that an economist would say we know for sure, that demand curves slope down, that the higher the price, the less people buy. They'd probably assert that the law of one price, they call it the law, it's fancy language, that if something is selling for $5 here and $2 here, that people will go to work moving the high price good over here to make a profit over here, until through arbitrage it becomes one price. What else? I think those are the two that come to mind of things that are true. More diffusely, an economist would say, well, we know that markets generally work better than command top-down economies for achieving both efficient results in the marketplace and also for creating growth. That if you let people pursue the natural impulse to buy and sell, that things will work out better than if you embark in a utopian scheme and try to prevent that in the name of social justice or something else. And we run these big natural experiments in history with respect to those things. The Russian Revolution, you could say, was sort of one national experiment that took that. Today, or Chinese communism was in the nature of an experiment that didn't work in the view of the Chinese. Today, an economist, I think, would cite Venezuela or North Korea as things that economists would have said truly wouldn't work very well, truly don't work. But that's the kind of, it's not a wheelbarrow full of smoke, but it's not the truth of physics either. So the answer to your question is that people are a hell of a lot more complicated than particles or elements, compounds. Yeah, please.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
I found it very broad and very interesting. I have my own ideas about whether economics is a science or not, but
Yeah.
what I'm most interested right now is something that I think it's a very big injustice, because when we science writers or science journalists write in newspapers, people ask us to be very clear and to make complicated things understandable to the common citizen. But I find that every newspaper has an economics and business section, and the people who write there are not asked to write in a simple fashion. They use this complicated language and concepts that most of us who are not into economics simply don't understand. And I wonder why they are not asked to be clear. And also because I find that economy is one of the most important disciplines in modern societies, whether or not it's scientific. The point is it's used to make decisions about economies in all the world. And I think it would be really important that the common citizen could understand basic economic concepts And I don't find the newspapers and journalists are doing this job. So what are your thoughts on this?
It's great. I think economists agree with you generally, and they try to make themselves more clear in a variety of ways. They recognize the problem. It's a universal problem. One of the impulses behind the creation of the Nobel Prize in the 60s, behind the scenes, were Swedes making exactly the argument that you've made, that we economists aren't clear enough about what we've done, and what we've done will have no effect unless we explain it clearly and forcefully to people. So let's create a prize to sort of demarcate the progress that we think we've made, and let's take a special effort to explain the prize to people clearly. So if you look at the Nobel site each time they give an economics prize, there's always a press release that's really quite simple and straightforward. Then there's a more newspaper-like exposition of the topic, and then there's 40 or 50 pages of scientific background to the thing. So as a setting of the example, that starts up at the very top. It moves down to universities in particular fields. The microeconomists in the world, meaning at a half a dozen, maybe 10 first-rate universities, top universities, have got a new web page whose name I forget, where they hire people like me. I don't do it, but they hire people like me to translate one particularly good paper, one paper that they think is just the best thing that year, into English each week, and they put it on the web. So that's just a drop in the thing, but the real gap in this explanation business is at our end of the business. The newspapers don't hire enough of us. I say newspapers, but I mean the whole firmament of media. They don't hire enough of us. They don't pay us enough. They don't give us enough space, and they don't insist on high enough standards from us to narrow that gap so that you and I would think, boy, this is great, isn't it? This is really going swimmingly. The whole news business is in such turmoil now that I can't be especially optimistic about that. But I'll tell you briefly about my situation if you tell me about yours. Tell us more about what you write and with what frequency. What do you do?
Well, I'm a science writer. I only write in a newspaper as a columnist, not as a reporter. Right. And I only write about science, natural science. Uh-huh. But I'm getting more and more interested in economics because, you cannot be unaware of the importance of economics. So I'm a chemist.
Yeah.
So for me, economics is very difficult to get to grips with because we chemists learn that matter and energy are not created, only transformed. And economics is totally different. You get to create wealth, and I've been trying to read about economics, and I really find it difficult to try to understand the finance section in the newspapers.
So that's great. This is why I came, not just to embarrass myself by not speaking Spanish and knowing next to nothing about Mexico, but I came to talk to science journalists and to learn from them. And when we're done, we'll talk some more about specific steps. One thing is, in your case, I do get the Spanish edition. I don't even have the title, but I'll send it to you, of this book I wrote. It's a good introduction to all of this and stuff. But there's nothing that enables science journalists, a journalist, period, to learn about something more than writing about it. Teachers say the same thing. I never really learned Spanish until I had to teach it. So edging out into the field, writing a little bit more about economics, as much as your editors will permit you to publish. You write weekly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then, write 4 economics columns a year, and there's plenty to fill 4, and then 6, and then you reach some sort of natural balance, because the stuff going on in the sciences today, all the sciences, and especially the social sciences, not even the Swedes call it economics any longer. They call it the economic sciences, and they're going to get more imperial and start insisting that psychology and sociology are economics. They're not. They're their own fields. But there's so much going on in the social sciences today that you can go on writing for the rest of your life about it. But learning about it is we have conferences like this to talk about it and to make it more susceptible. So, but let's by all means, and anybody else who wants to talk along these lines, let's get together at lunch and talk some more about it.
I promise I will.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hi.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Soy Silvia Domínguez Gutiérrez, profesora investigadora de la Universidad de Guadalajara, Jalisco. I'm going to speak in Spanish.
Yeah, but let me get the volume up here.
Okay.
That's I see it. It's got a plus sign. Oh, there. It doesn't have a plus sign. Okay. Go.
Ajá. Hice una investigación hace unos años sobre qué encontraba yo en algunos periódicos, prensa escrita, sobre las disciplinas científicas. Inicié con 2 periódicos y ahora lo estoy ampliando a varios. En aquella ocasión encontré, mi apuesta era que iba a encontrar más de ciencias naturales, más de las disciplinas en ciencias naturales, específicamente en salud. Y sorpresa, basada en evidencias empíricas, sobre todo latinoamericanas, en estudios que habían hecho en diferentes partes de Sudamérica, Centroamérica, incluso en México. Y esa era mi apuesta. Y consulté estos diarios en todas sus secciones, no únicamente las que están catalogadas como científicas, y me encontré que la mayor parte era sobre economía política principalmente. Sí fue una sorpresa porque estos diarios sí abordaban más cuestiones de economía política, aprovechando las coyunturas por las que estaba pasando el país. Analizando la información, de qué tipo de economía están hablando estos periódicos. Sabemos que en Jalisco, en el estado de Jalisco, hay, sobre todo, predomina más bien una economía muy gubernamental, como neoliberal, pues, y encontré que hay muy poca crítica, no sé si economía política crítica en estos escritos, y en parte se entiende por qué las políticas editoriales están muy marcadas y hay como líneas, ¿no? Esto se escribe y esto no se escribe. Entonces, ¿hasta qué punto, pues, la libertad para comunicar economía política crítica, que al parecer dentro de los estudios de la comunicación está teniendo auge y como crítica apuntando hacia un marxismo pero no ortodoxo? Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿cómo usted ve esto y si para dónde va dirigido? Ya nos dio una explicación más o menos histórica, pero estas tendencias al parecer como que están impuestas, ¿no?, por esa agenda setting.
This is just awful. I've got this up at top volume, and your words drown this out. So I want somebody, either the translator or somebody else, all I took from that was critica. Somebody give that back to me in a very short English.
¿Quién me traduce? Porque
Or, yeah.
Sí, sí, que le traduzca yo.
There's,
¿Usted me puede traducir?
No, no, pues no hay traductores ahí.
yeah, I just couldn't hear. I couldn't hear what she said. So, but it's important. I mean, everybody else heard and understood.
Le voy a decir,
Yeah, good.
I'm going to translate it.
Yeah, but so what, yeah. Give us 2 minutes.
Ah, ya está la traductora. Ah, ok. Gracias, la traductora.
In journalism, it's the most part of the publications. She was like looking for health articles, science articles, but what she sees is that economics is predominant in the newspapers. And what she says it's imposed by the government, and there is no criticism. It's like very light, very superficial. Yeah? So that's she's asking your opinion about if this can be changed or not.
Yeah. This just, well, it's working. It just isn't loud enough, and I mean, I could barely hear it. The translation was terrific. But
Thank
that,
you very
so
much.
if let's just do this again.
But the
Yeah,
audio was
this
not
is
good.
yeah.
But basically it
If you
was-
just stay in this seat, you and I can talk. So I think I understand that question now. And the answer, my answer, of course, is where did you go? There you go. Is that I know nothing about the situation in Mexico or in Spain in 1976 or in Chile in 72 or 79 or today. I do know that governments, especially in nations where governments do a lot of funding of this sort of thing, that what you get is a line that they want you to teach to students, and economics is a powerful discipline for making people, for controlling people, for making them do what's wanted, and you know, for making people do what's wanted, incentives, that's not so bad. For stopping them from thinking about important things like justice, it's very bad. Economics is extremely weak on justice. And there's a really very good book that's just appeared in English called The Nobel Factor, and the subtitle is something like The Market Turn, the Swedish democracy. It's all about the author's conviction that the Swedes cooked up the Nobel Prize to sort of suppress enthusiasm for planning in Sweden in the 50s, and to create sort of market liberalism. Try that. To create market to give support, prestige to market liberalism of the sort that's really sort of governed world trade for the last 40 years, say, something like that. What they call the Washington Consensus. Well, there's just a lot more to economics than the Washington Consensus. And I would say, again, the language is a problem, but of all the work on the limitations of economics and the usefulness of economics that's been done in the last 10 years, the best work has been done by this Turkish economist named Danny Roderick, Turkish U.S. citizenship, teaches at Harvard's Kennedy School. And he has a book called Economics Rules, or Economic Rules. It's very different whether that S is there or not. And it's a book full of enthusiasm for economics, telling you why companies do what they do, but explaining why it's so limited in governing our political life. It really doesn't have that much to say about politics, except you shouldn't put the price of oil down to, $1, 10 cents a gallon, and expect people to produce gas or food and stuff. So again, it's all I've got to share are English titled books, but the Danny Roderick thing, Roderick is really an important guy, and even, I mean, I wish I'd come to talk about Danny Roderick instead of Paul Romer, because he has more of a message for science journalism in Mexico. Invite him next year. That's the best I can do. Please. Yeah.
Hola, buen día. Me llamo Rolando Isita, soy el director académico de la Dirección General de Divulgación de la Ciencia, que entre otras cosas en México tiene el Museo de Ciencias Universum. Yo tengo mis serias dudas, en serio, no tengo muchas evidencias desde la perspectiva científica que la economía sea una ciencia. Pero lo que sí sabemos es que los países que invierten en ciencia y tecnología son las potencias del mundo. Estados Unidos, Alemania, Francia, Inglaterra, recientemente China. China en 1950 estaba en una revolución y ahora pone en jaque a las economías mundiales porque ha invertido en ciencia y tecnología. Corea del Sur. Y nos hizo usted un repaso en la historia y no escuchamos qué significaba el Imperio Austrohúngaro y los alemanes del espacio vital, pero que sí sabemos que hubo un tratado de Versalles que le hace pagar a Alemania toda la guerra y que da pretexto para que haya una inflación galopante en este... Sí, claro.
So, yeah,
Sí.
carry, yeah.
No, es que a lo mejor no quiero ir.
You finish.
Yeah.
You finish, and then we'll talk for a minute, and then I'll answer.
So he would like to know that there are many powers, world powers like the United States, France, Germany, and they invest in research.
I can speak in English, but it's not the same.
So what are we going to do in the future? Because China in 1950 was in a revolution,
Yeah.
and now is endangering the world
Yeah,
economy.
yeah.
So that was his question.
So,
¿Qué onda?
yeah, more? Yeah.
¿Sí?
Go
Bueno,
on.
En fin, viene un acuerdo de Inglaterra con Estados Unidos, secreto. Winston Churchill le cede secretos científicos a Estados Unidos a cambio de que entre en la guerra. Viene una ley de préstamo y arriendo que Estados Unidos sí libera al mundo de los problemas de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, pero también porque va a cobrar mucho dinero de esta ley de préstamo y arriendo, el plan Marshall, viene el Sputnik de los soviéticos y hoy una derrama en inversión, no importa si es gasto y si es mucho, en física sobre todo, en los Estados Unidos, porque no, ahorita es un bip bip, mañana será una bomba atómica y va un gran crecimiento y tiene un impacto económico. No escuché yo en todo el tiempo nada de esto, de la economía, y finalmente, y las más recientes, es que burbujas hipotecarias donde los bancos crean unas hipotecas para casas amparadas en ningún capital, se inflan y resulta que son un fraude. Se vienen abajo los bancos y los gobiernos rescatan a los bancos, los 2, 3 culpables, algún banquero en la cárcel, y con el dinero de los impuestos de las poblaciones se rescata a los bancos alemanes, norteamericanos, mexicanos, igual algunos negocios no funcionan, intervienen los estados, los rescatan, pero si hay un gasto en seguridad social, si hay un gasto en salud, entonces no es populismo. Eso a mí me hace pensar que el aspecto científico de la economía no lo encuentro por ningún lado y que son más bien decisiones ideológicas o una respuesta angustiada de lo que dijo tal señor ahora en las elecciones de Estados Unidos, Trump, y crece o baja la bolsa. ¿Qué de científico tiene eso? Me gustaría escuchar su opinión.
Did you understand? He's talking about investment. And for instance, if Trump is saying something stupid, tomorrow the dollar is going to rise or it's going to go down. So he doesn't think economics is a science. He thinks it's because all over the world the governments they invest in research and science and everything, but they are not having international support. So anything, the minimal thing, it's just going to burst into something bad, and the economy can break.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he doesn't think that because of those reasons, it's a science.
Yeah.
So if he's asking what is your opinion.
So, where did you go? Oh, there. Thank you. I have a pretty good sense of what you said, and I'm, as a journalist, I'm in no position to argue with a professor. But the best guy, the best guy I know on this topic is a Venezuelan whose office is just around the corner from Daddy Roderick at the Kennedy School at Harvard. His name is Ricardo Hausman, and he's part of the Venezuelan diaspora, from which the United States has benefited greatly. Hausman has made a very careful study, theoretical study of the world division of labor, what's done and made in China, what's done and made in Germany, who makes what from what, and he's done it all in a great big pretty book that costs too much money called a map of economic complexity. I'm not sure that the terminology is so useful, but it's a very, very useful way to think about the world you described, a world where take China's revolution. China's revolution in 1950, all it did was make them a poorer country, a less industrialized country. I mean, they built steel mills, but they participated not at all in the world economy. And for the 25 years after that Mao died, they really were just a mess. China. It was a very poor and unhappy place, all through the Cultural Revolution. As soon as he died, the people who had been the technocrats and the scientists who'd been the victims of the Cultural Revolution, they got in charge, and they began sending out teams of politicians first, and then teams of scientists and businessmen to other countries to see what the opportunities were out there, to sort of study the things that Ricardo Hausman studies. And they began bringing back ideas. Mostly they opened China up to foreign investment, and people like Apple and Microsoft began investing in China. Before you knew it, this is a little like the Syntec story, the Chinese companies had learned this non-rival, partially excludable good. They'd learned the secrets of the companies from the West that invested in China, and they began doing it themselves better and better and better. That process, is exactly what happened in the Mexican pharmaceutical industry. And if you choose to see it very broadly, the Mexican narcotic drug industry as well. But Mexico really found its way into that industry simply by paying attention to what Russell Marker did, and the fluctuations of the dollar didn't make that much difference. The reason Hausman is so useful, and people like Hausman and Danny Roderick, is that they work for institutions like the World Bank, and whose whole purpose is to scout out opportunities for Mexico and India and Saudi Arabia to join this international division of labor in a way that'll be beneficial to its citizens. And That's the work of technology and development. Governments do it too, and I think the Mexican government is Jesus said as we talked about this, it's very interested in promoting this, but it's very hard work, and it's the last 100 years of growth have been so fast and so explosive that the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese have been so successful at getting up on sort of the top of the pyramid that the opportunities left for everybody else are much less frequent, much less common. So it's a really dangerous situation. You know, the inequality is great and seems to be getting greater, both within countries and in the world, and there's no obvious way to fix it. I certainly haven't got one, except by paying attention to the opportunities as they arise. I think, take software, that's a good example. Software is one of those jobs that requires very precise thinking, a lot of patience, and long hours. It turns out that India is really, really good at software, and has been taking that business away from the United States for 15, 20 years now. So it's in that narrow niche, there's an opportunity for Indian companies to grow. I'm sure there are opportunities like that besides pharmaceuticals in Mexico. And for a long time, of course, the automotive industry was going like gangbusters. But it's very selective. It's not one big revolutionary wave. It's lots of hints and possibilities pursued. That's a kind of a conservative answer, but it's all I have. Your turn.
Hello. Okay. Mi nombre es Guillermo.
I hear you fine, but I hear you without these.
That's right. We're having some issues with the translation. Okay. I'm going to talk in Spanish so the people can follow.
Let me point out that it's less important that I hear you and understand what you're saying than that the audience hears you. I mean, it's why we came together, so that people besides me could make, not speeches, but say things. So don't worry about it. I'll get the gist of it. I'll do my best.
Ok, es una pregunta un poco tonta, a silly question, pero alguna vez lo discutía con Manuel Lino, no sé si está por aquí. Nuestro premio Nobel de Química, Mario Molina, alguna vez mencionó que el costo económico de no adoptar medidas para combatir el cambio climático sería elevadísimo, alrededor del 1% del Producto Interno Bruto mundial. La pregunta es, ¿cómo determinan esto? Insisto, es una pregunta muy tonta porque no soy economista. ¿Qué factores se deben tener en cuenta para hacer ese tipo de cálculos que a mí me siguen pareciendo también pues, muy difíciles? ¿Cómo establecen ese tipo de cálculos, David? Gracias.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. That's loud. Do you mean about the atmospheric physics and the
No.
solar radiation, or the economics of it?
No, I'm talking about the economics at the ground level.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. I mean, it's going to turn out that economics is really valuable in minimizing and in arresting climate change. And the basic argument within economics is always about prices versus quotas, about charging people a tax to put carbon in the atmosphere, or simply telling them you can only put so much carbon in the atmosphere no matter what. I'm not very current with that, but I know that technologies exist within economics either way to dramatically slow the generation of greenhouse gases and stuff. The other aspect of global warming has to do with science and technology and the rate of innovation, which is exactly the stuff that Romer has talked about in the past. It's very easy to say, oh, we'll just invent our way out of the problem. We'll stop using fossil fuels. We'll use solar. We'll use hydrogen. We'll have big fusion reactors and distribute it. Those questions are susceptible to economic investigation, but I don't know anybody who claims to have an answer. I know that the group of people who've worked hardest on this over the years, who've been most influential within economic science, are broadly associated with a guy at Yale named William Nordhaus. And when they give an economics prize for environmental science, it'll be to Nordhaus and some others. So if you're a journalist and you're looking for the vector of people who do serious work on this, that's the place to start. And it's a pretty thoroughly developed. There's a very successful annual review publication of resource economics that comes out it's annual, it comes out once a year. That probably represents the frontier of climate science and resource economics. So I have so few answers, but I know where to look for answers. That's what journalists do. That's the best I've got.
Okay, there's a lot of ways. Thank you, David.
Yeah. Same thing again. Anybody wants to talk about that at lunch, we can talk more. But yeah, that's enough. Good.